having another event, and Bill Chalupa will come up here from Colorado to join on this event. And the event will be about a half an hour of a panel discussion, and then about as long as you want for other discussion about this controversial essay, The Death of Environmentalism, whatever that might mean. But it's gotten a lot of attention. I think it could generate a lot of interesting discussion here. So that's this Thursday, just next door, a little bit bigger building. Joining Andrew will be back for that, and also Daniel Kimmons and Tracy Stone Manning will be here, and it'll be a nice panel. And we invite you to participate and come and discuss that with us. Next week, we have several other events. Yuriko Sato, a really interesting professor from the Rhode Island School of Design. She's a native Japanese and is going to give a talk on the Japanese garden. It's going to be an environmental talk about how we experience nature, beauty in nature. Another talk is Ned Hedinger, a really interesting philosopher from South Carolina, will be here to talk about objectivity and aesthetics. Why some environments are beautiful and worth preserving more than others. So it's a very interesting talk by Ned. And he'll bring he's a photographer, and he'll have some of his slides with him. And then also that week, on Thursday, Christopher Preston, we thank him. He's put together a panel with Holmes, Ralston, Ned Henninger, and Albert will be there. And John Hart, a philosopher who used to be a theologian. He used to be in Helena, but now is at Boston University. There'll be a panel on science, religion, and environmental ethics. And then Holmes Ralston's going to give another talk on generating intelligent life on Earth's 6 looming questions in environmental biology. And that'll be next Friday, so that should be an interesting talk. He recently won the Templeton Award, which is a really prestigious award for advancement in the understanding of science and religion. But you're here to hear Andrew Watt talk about environmental ecological restoration. And I'll give you a little rundown on Andrew. He's been very busy. Andrew is the author of 70 articles and book chapters on these topics, and is editor or co-editor of 16 books, including The Aesthetics of Everyday Life, Animal Pragmatism, Rethinking Non-Human Relationships, Moral and Political Reasoning and Environmental Practice, Environmental Ethics and Anthology, Beneath the Surface, Critical Essays on the Philosophy of Deep Ecology, Technology and the Good Life, Philosophies of Place, Social Ecology After Bookchin, Environmental Pragmatism, one of my favorites, and Real Arguments, Film, Philosophy, and Social Criticism. Andrew's currently at the University of Washington, and also there he's at the in the Public Affairs, Evans School, exactly. And so Andrew's been a good friend for coming out here and being very generous with his time, and we appreciate him being here. And so I'd like you to welcome him.
Thank you. Thank you, Dane. So it's really wonderful to be back in Missoula. Some of you know that this was my first job, was here at the University of Montana. And in fact, I lectured, I gave the Ethics 101 class, Aristotle, Kant, and Mill, in this particular classroom. It was a fantastic class. I remember distinctly one day a dog walking into the classroom with a Frisbee in its mouth. It's certainly sort of Missoula moment. It's really great to be back to see my old friends and colleagues, Albert Borgman, Bill Chalupa, other friends that have come here since I left, like Chris Preston, my old student Dave Strohmeyer, who's now running the show, as far as I understand, right? So, what I want to do today is sort of have a conversation with all of you that in some respects I began about 8 years ago when I was teaching here. And it's about restoration ecology, which is a practice of recreating ecosystems that don't exist at a particular place anymore. And this is the next, what I'm going to present to you is the next to the last chapter of the book, which is on the historical dimensions of restoration ecology and raising this question of whether or not when we try to restore nature, do we have obligations only to the natural objects that we're trying to restore, the ecosystems that we're trying to restore, or does this in fact extend to the human communities and the human place on the landscape that was there before us? So what I'll go through in this talk is four parts. First of all, I'll just give you a little overview of the importance of restoration ecology. If you're not convinced that it was an important topic of environmental management, hopefully you'll be convinced afterwards. Secondly, what are the philosophers saying about restoration? Start with my own sort of people, as it were, and see what they're saying, and then give some answers to the general philosophical rejection, mostly, of restoration ecology. And then very broadly sketch an alternative way of thinking about the value of nature from a recent book that I just finished with two colleagues at Lancaster University in the United Kingdom on the role of narrative in understanding the value of nature. And then finally bring this back to home to talk about an actual example, the Vintondale Acid Mine Drainage Project in western Pennsylvania that I worked on a few years ago, which I think embodies the kinds of questions and hopefully the answers that I'm going to propose about what are the range of obligations we have to natural and human communities when we engage in restoration projects. So the importance of restoration ecology. How do we define restoration ecology? Well, I'll use this definition for now. The human practice of restoring natural areas and ecosystems, especially those damaged by anthropogenic causes. If you look at the main organization that covers restoration ecology, the Society for Ecological Restoration, when they define restoration ecology, you get pretty much the first part of that definition, but not the last part. They don't limit the practice of restoration to just damage that's caused by humans. Certainly we're doing lots of restoration in Louisiana right now, resulting from what we call a natural disaster. This is a common practice in restoration. But the vast majority of the projects, I think, are aimed really at the kinds of rectifying the sorts of damage that humans have caused to the environment around them. And when people sort of make arguments for why we should restore, the tradition in the literature in restoration ecology is to focus on the ecological arguments for restoration, and I pretty much agree with that. There are some philosophers and social theorists who try to make strict philosophical claims about why it is that we need to do restoration ecology. There's a very interesting book that came out a couple of years ago by William Jordan, one of the first scientists to really organize the science of restoration ecology when he was the education director at the University of Wisconsin Arboretum, where he tries to make a claim that restoration is a way of healing our relationship with the natural world, and that in itself is justification for these kinds of projects. But normally I don't go that far in my thinking, but think that really the three main reasons for restoration are, first of all, habitat restoration. Restoration of a habitat, especially involving endangered species. And when you have a species, for example, that's listed on the Endangered Species Act and is critically threatened, then provisions of the ESA can come in and mandate restoration of habitats, mitigation of the effects of pollution, especially clean air and clean water. And then probably the third one on the list here, but maybe the most important one, the mitigation of the effects of exotic species on biodiversity. And there's no longer a scientific consensus on the role of exotic species in limiting biodiversity, but there is certainly lots and lots of examples that still persist that show us that when you have exotic species that come into an area that are unchecked, then they can become a great threat on biodiversity. There are abundant examples of rabbits in Australia. Australians sent their possums over to New Zealand, which caused all kinds of problems over there. We've got kudzu, purple loosestrife, all sorts of things in North America that cause lots of problems. And if you think about the projects, we're talking about things, especially North America, the real heart, the real legacy of restoration is tallgrass prairie restoration. Some of that even happening here, if you look, I believe, as I recall, right after I left, there was a planting some prairie around here in the Clark Fork watershed. Restoration of forests for some kind of mosaic resembling old growth in the Pacific Northwest where I now live. Mitigation of wetlands. Mitigation of the loss of wetlands. There's a huge cottage industry in the U.S. on mitigating the effects of wetland loss. And if you'll remember, the first George Bush, remember him, in his second State of the Union address, he had this phrase that he trucked out. My students should know it. What is it?
No net loss.
No net loss of wetlands. That's right, no net loss of wetlands. And that was his claim to fame to being an environmental president. And so whenever you destroyed a wetland for some kind of product, then you had to mitigate it by recreating a wetland somewhere else. And in order to do this, to really have this policy, Bush had to order the EPA to redefine what a wetland was. But otherwise, they sort of did pretty well. And they got a whole industry out there of wetland mitigation. So there's tons of projects out there in lots of very interesting ways. If we look at the importance of restoration ecology, I think if you took a line item of all the projects that the federal government, for example, is paying for right now, from the Superfund sites that you all know from just down the road in Butte, to other projects like this, the biggest outlay of money in the US now on environmental management really is mostly for restoration. And this is one of the most high-profile ones, the restoration of the Florida Everglades here in southern Florida, for a variety of reasons, from saving species habitat to creating a sustainable water supply for Miami into the future. This is a $7.8 billion project that was passed at the end of the Clinton administration, bipartisan approval on this in conjunction with the Jeb Bush gubernatorial administration in Florida. So there's lots of working across the political divide on restoration when these kinds of arguments can be made. And of course, what we're seeing now in Louisiana will be massive billions and billions and billions of dollars essentially put towards restoration. Another sort of thing that I think is very important about restoration is its potential for generating public participation in nature. And this is really the bulk of the moral arguments, the moral justifications for how I think we should do restoration, not that we should do restoration, but how they should be done, that I cover in my book, though I won't talk much about that here, except for just to show you this one slide. This is, this map is of the Chicago wilderness area, which is, I think, the project that I just love saying Chicago wilderness. It's just like, I can't say that enough, and grin, and I've been saying it for 10 years and it still makes me very happy. So when the city of Chicago was founded, it was clustered around, as we know, Lake Michigan, and as part of the City Beautiful movement and under the influence of Hull House and a number of other organizations, there was a necklace of forest preserves that were set aside at the time outside the city limits. Of course, what happens is the City of Chicago gets bigger and jumps over the forest preserves. So now this necklace of forest preserves, these light green areas, are strung all throughout the Chicago urban region. And since the mid-'80s, there have been experimental restorations on restoring these forest preserves, led by the Nature Conservancy, and the primary person who behind this is a guy named Steve Packard, a brilliant, wonderful guy, not an ecologist, but really sort of came up with, was really the major force behind pushing for these restorations. And over the years, up until 1997, when a reporter for the New York Times named William Stevens wrote a book about these restorations called Miracle Under the Oaks. By '97, they had restored 14,000 acres of these forest preserves back to their original pre-settlement state, which was argued to be an oak savanna. Up until that time, because of suburbanization, because the city had jumped over these forest preserves, you had the migration of exotic species, mostly European buckthorn, which was shading out all the native plants in the area and really creating a very new kind of ecosystem for different kinds of critters than would have traditionally been there. And because this was set aside at a certain point in the history of Illinois and the history of Chicago, it was arguably the case, this is the case that Packard made, that these forest preserves inside the city of Chicago were the only old growth in the entire state of Illinois, because they're the only thing that wasn't timbered or put under the plow for agriculture or built under for urban settlement. So if you wanted to make sure that you didn't lose the local biodiversity, right? You didn't want to have local extinction of those species, then it was these forest preserves which were the front line of the defense. And it's a long story, and maybe we can talk about more of it later. But when Packard came up with the idea for restoring these forest preserves, It was at a moment when the Illinois state government was experiencing a kind of a government shutdown, just like New Jersey had recently, and the federal government, as you remember, had a number of years ago during the Clinton administration. And at that time, sort of seeing this gap, Packard came in and said, hey, look, I'll take care of these forest preserves with volunteers. It won't cost you a dime. And he was given free license to do this project. So all of the restorations that have occurred here, the original 14,000 acres going up to the late 90s, and they've got a management plan that goes up to 250,000 acres, going up to southern Wisconsin and down to northern Illinois, folding in federal land. See the dark green federal land here. The Nature Conservancy now buying up a lot of plots to interconnect these areas, is all being done by volunteer labor. And what it's created is this amazing possibility for stewardship, or I prefer the term ecological citizenship, of people actually getting their hands dirty, working in the land, and getting a sense of connection with this area that they might not otherwise have had. And so far, over the course of all the Chicago restorations, you've had 20,000 volunteers, which is an extremely high proportion for a restoration project like this. There's lots of other examples of volunteer restoration, but this is really the biggest one. And at a certain point, the North Central Forest Experiment Station in Evanston, Illinois, sponsored a bunch of sociologists, gave a bunch of small grants to go and measure, sort of talk to, right? Measure the responses of these volunteers, and found about exactly what you'd expect, that these people seem to have a much stronger commitment to the land around them, a greater awareness of global environmental issues, a greater amount of respect for not only their local environments, but the critical endangered environments of other places around the world. And this just leads me to sort of think that one of the contributions that an ethicist like myself could make to this kind of issue is to say that when we do restorations, we have a moral obligation to, as much as we can, open them up to public participation, given the kinds of concrete connections that are possible between people and the land around them, given this kind of activity. And the reason is because, in terms of environmental management, restoration ecology is, it's a lot like gardening, you know? And a lot of us know how to garden. A lot of us have that skill set. Now, it's a historically and ecologically informed version of gardening, here going from buckthorn forest to oak savanna, which is sort of a prairie with sort of sporadic oak around it. But, you know, you take things out, you know, you weed things, you burn things, Dave likes that, right? And you cut down trees, and then you plant things. And in terms of environmental management, it's a lot easier to get involved in this, given the skill set involved, than things like, I don't know, last summer is one example. I volunteered for an Audubon bird survey in Western Massachusetts. And, you know, I don't want to offend anyone here, but birders are really weird people. I just want to tell you, this is my sort of first exposure to the birding population out there, if you want to call it that. And, you know, and like you sort of, there's no trail. You know, this is not pleasant. It's mosquitoes and poison ivy and snakes and all kinds of things, and you're sort of going through and you're getting scratched and bitten and, you know, and breaking out in hives, and also sunstroke, you know, it's awful, right? And then you hear this tweet, you know, and like, what was that? You know, I have no idea, which one is that? And they're like, oh, that's a yellow-bellied sapsucker flying south for lunch or something. I don't know, right? And so highly skilled, right? And maybe even a little, you know, committed in a good way to sort of participate in that kind of environmental management. But this is the kind of environmental management that I think anyone can participate in. And that's part of the success of having 20,000 volunteers, because you can actually get people involved in this very quickly. Okay. So restoration sounds great, doesn't it? You know, sounds like a fantastic thing. What do the philosophers say about restoration? And here's, I'm going to talk about two figures sort of quickly. Robert Eliot, this is his book on the left, an Australian philosopher, and Eric Katz, very close, dear friend of mine, friend of many people in the room, on the right. And in this case, you really can judge the book by the cover, this faking nature, right? Sort of is the critique of restoration ecology, and the color green there, I think, is intentional. Like, this is bad. Now, to understand their criticism of restoration ecology, I've got to sort of take you through a very quick tutorial of environmental philosophy and sort of the basic distinctions and intuitions behind environmental philosophy. But it will be quick, I promise, and I think hopefully clear enough. So environmental ethics as a discipline inside philosophy departments, so there are older roots, Aldo Leopold's 1949 Sand County Almanac, if some of you know this book, especially the next to last essay. The land ethic is a sort of something we always go back to. But inside institutional philosophy departments, teaching classes in environmental ethics, holding conferences on environmental ethics, writing articles, these kinds of things really goes back to the early 70s. And the two questions that environmental ethicists were asking themselves at the time is, or these people starting to call themselves environmental ethicists really, in what way does philosophy or the history of Western ethics contribute to the environmental problems that people are starting to recognize? And secondly, how can philosophy make a contribution to the resolution of environmental problems? And the answer that they came up with is pretty interesting. So and it points to this first distinction here. The answer to the first question, how did the history of ethics create the environmental problems that you've got the popular movements of environmentalism in the late 60s and early 70s starting to coalesce around, is anthropocentrism. Defines something like this: to arbitrarily grant preferential consideration to human interests as opposed to the interests of other beings or the environment, right? And the idea was that the great traditions of ethics, the ones that I taught in this very classroom, 8 years ago, Aristotle, Kant, Mill, utilitarianism, these kinds of theories, gave you lots of arguments for why we owe minimal moral consideration to other humans, but did not consider that we owed obligations to anything that was not a human, let alone something like the land, right, which is what Leopold was after. So one example, and one of my favorite examples, is that the great philosopher Immanuel Kant at one point discusses issues about sort of our obligations to other animals. And Kant doesn't give the example of torturing puppies. I think his example is, why you shouldn't beat your horse in the street. But I like torturing puppies because it's much more vivid and more people can sort of imagine that as being a bad thing. So Kant, we can imagine Kant saying, why should we not torture puppies? And Kant says, well, you shouldn't torture puppies because if you torture puppies, you'll become inured towards causing pain to something, and then therefore you might be more likely to cause pain to another human being. And you have moral obligations to other human beings. You need to respect their autonomy. And so we shouldn't do something that would lead us to cause harm to another human. But we don't have direct obligations to the puppies themselves, cute as they are. And you see this, you see a lot of this in sort of other sort of moral theories, lots of sort of reasons why we have moral obligations to other humans, but nothing about whether we have obligations to other things. So perhaps it was the case, the early environmental ethicists in the 1970s said, is that the history of ethics had sort of made it safe to think that our obligations to nature were merely a question of prudence and not a question of morality. Now the answer, remember there were those two questions. How has philosophy contributed to the environmental problems we're seeing today? And then secondly, how can philosophy contribute to the resolution of these problems? The answer was to come up with a whole new kind of ethic, what they called a non-anthropocentric ethic. And this would be some kind of ethic which would provide justification for extending some minimal level of moral consideration to entities other than humans. And out of this, you get 1,000 ships are launched of different sort of answers to this question. Some of you, I'm sure, have heard of Peter Singer, the leading animal welfare philosopher in the world today. And he gives lots of arguments for, why we do have direct obligations to those cute little puppies, and also to cows and other things. And these gets him moral arguments for vegetarianism, against animal experimentation, these sort of things. Now, the early environmental ethicists then combined this distinction with a second distinction between instrumental value and intrinsic value, and this is an older, more traditional distinction in the history of philosophy. Instrumental value is the worth entities or objects have in fulfilling an end for something else, like this clicker thing, which advances in this really wonderful way, right? Advances these pictures so that I can go through this presentation. It has this instrumental value for me in a particular way. It has what we consider to be intrinsic value, the worth of entities or objects in their own right, independent of their value to any other end. And the kinds of things, according to the anthropocentric canon of ethics, at least one kind of thing that has intrinsic value are human beings. Some people would directly use this language of intrinsic value. Others, like Kant, didn't use this language of intrinsic value, but we can, I think, fairly reconstruct and paraphrase some of his arguments as being about the intrinsic value of human beings. And so what environmental ethicists want to do is they want to reject a view, an anthropocentric understanding of the value of nature as only being instrumentally valuable. And they want to instead substitute or come up with a theory, a non-anthropocentric theory, a non-human-centered theory for why things other than humans might have intrinsic value, might have value independent of the value that we get out of them. So, you know, the anthropocentrist who thinks that nature only has instrumental value sees the value of nature as the board feet of, the value of a forest is the board feet of timber that you can get out of a forest. The value of a piece of land is the agricultural worth, the mineral worth, the sorts of things. The technical term, by the way, that in environmental ethics that we give to anthropocentrists who think that nature only has instrumental value is that we call you an economist, if that is your view about nature. So in opposition, we want to come up with this other kind of theory. Now, this leads to a kind of an interesting conclusion with respect to where we're going to go with restoration. For many of the, doesn't necessarily fall out of this, but for many of the early theorists of environmental ethics, this commitment, right, that what the field is going to be about is finding a non-anthropocentric theory of the intrinsic value of nature, why nature is independently valuable in its own right. It might even be the kind of thing that generates a series of obligations that we have to adhere to, entails a kind of a distinction between natural and non-natural entities. And the argument goes something like this. There are the Peter Singers of the world who say that we have obligations to those cute puppies and to cows and chickens and horses and all the other sort of jumpy, hoppy, crawly things in the world, but as individuals. And then there's a stream of environmental ethics that really kind of comes out of people like Aldo Leopold, saying that we need a land ethic, that it's not enough, that the science of ecology, right, is not a science of the welfare of individual things. If everything is doing, all the little individual organisms in a forest are doing well, it's not going to be a healthy forest, because things have to die, right, in ecosystems in order for them to flourish. And given that that's what the science of ecology is pointing towards, then many environmental ethicists want to take a more holistic approach and say and give arguments for why it is the case that collective entities, the land itself, species have this kind of intrinsic value. And we have to value them in a particular kind of way, and this generates obligations towards them. And when you make that argument, you're going to have to come up with some kind of demarcation, right? Some kind of demarcation to what you think is valuable in the world. What has this intrinsic value? In the old anthropocentric theories, we could do something like say, well, look, these theories only apply to human beings, so as long as you're a human, then I've got some sort of moral obligations that are owed to you. And more or less, we sort of figured that one out. Not so sure. Abortion controversy comes out of the not so sure cases. Is the fetus a person? I'm not so certain. Is it, if it is, then, you're more likely to sort of say that you're against abortion. If you don't think the fetus is a person, you're more likely to say that other rights can trump it. But for the most case, we kind of know what a human is, and we sort of think that all things that we're going to call humans in the world are owed some kind of moral obligations. But once you expand this theory, or a moral theory, to be inclusive of things that are, these whole environments, then you got to have some kind of demarcation between the kinds of environments you're talking about that are valuable in and of themselves and the kinds of things you're not talking about, right? And the kinds of environments that are valuable in themselves that have intrinsic value will have a higher status or a higher worth than other kinds of arguments, other kinds of landscapes. And that produces a contrast of cases. There are certain kinds of things which might appear natural, but they really aren't. And one example, and I won't go into any detail on this, but there are some holist environmental ethicists who want to say, for example, that farm animals aren't the kinds of things that we owe direct obligations to. They're artifacts, right? They're mooing, buying, clucking artifacts, but they're artifacts, right? They just simply, we've manipulated their gene lines for thousands of years. We produce them simply for the purpose of consumption. There's a difference between the value and the potential obligations we'd owe to a chicken, a barnyard chicken, and a wild grizzly bear. That's the intuition. And it turns out to be the case that you also get a similar kind of argument when it comes to these restored environments. because they appear to be environments, right? But like those barnyard animals, they're basically manipulated things produced by humans. They're squishy, green artifacts, right? Or prairie-looking, appearing artifacts. They're not natural environments. And that's the kind of the intuition that got the first philosophers who started talking about restoration was the kind of thing that they relied on that got their intuitions off the ground. So first one I'll talk about is Robert Elliott, the Australian. And the titles, I mean, they're great. I mean, Elliott and Katz are wonderful in the sense that they really tell you from the beginning, like from the title of the article. What's the title of Elliott's article? Faking Nature, right? You know, the news is not going to be good about restoration ecology. Katz's first article on restoration ecology is called The Big Lie, Human Restoration of Nature. I mean, they're just get straight to it. You know, this is not good. So here's how Elliott gets to his critique of restoration. And actually, he softened his critique of restoration quite a lot. But in the original article that he published in 1982, here's what he's taking on. He's taking on what he calls the restoration thesis. And he defines it in this way. The restoration thesis is that the destruction of what has value in nature is compensated for by the later creation of something of equal value. And he has in mind here cases, and I'm sure you can all think of local cases of something like this, of where a developer comes in and says, oh, you know, we need to take some minerals, right, out of this landscape. We need to cut down a few trees, but not to worry. We've got this science called ecological restoration that we've been working on really hard since the early 70s. And so after we sort of extract the minerals or do whatever we're going to do, the destructive act towards nature, then we'll fix it. We'll make it better. We'll put back the whole thing that was there before. And there are real cases out there like this, you know. And Elliott wants to argue that what's being substituted for there is not as valuable as the original nature that was there before. And this sort of act of mitigation or restoration just doesn't substitute for the thing that was there before. So this gives him an argument against this particular kind of what I want to call a very malicious restoration proposal. This is not the kind of restoration that's going on in Chicago, right, where people come along and say, well, we messed up, and now to fix this problem, we're going to save it. It's more of a sort of malicious form. But nonetheless, gets us his take on what's wrong from that intrinsic value standpoint with the value of restored environments. And here's his reasons. His reasons are that he thinks that he runs an analogy with art. And he says fake nature or restored nature is like faked art, you know? And the claim he's resting on, the intuition that he's giving us to consider, is that faked art, if you know someone who makes a facsimile of an art piece, or actually a copy, an illegal copy of an art piece, you know, here's a really good reproduction of the Mona Lisa. Now I'm going to steal the Mona Lisa and put this there before. We know it's never as valuable as the original. And the sort of theory that he's focusing on here is a theory of originary value, and this is sort of a theory that most contemporary aestheticians use when they talk about the value of a particular work of art, a particular painting. They don't sort of rely on its formal qualities, make it more beautiful than that painting, but it's a sort of like, this painting is an example of the best of its milieu that was created at a particular time in history by a particular person, and it's valuable because of those origins. And so because in the same way that we value artwork because of its origins, we also value original nature because of its origins. It was this thing that was produced without our assistance. And the people, the real lovers of wilderness, what they are loving, what they're attached to, are these things that are created by these, you know, millennial evolutionary processes. And that's what's valuable. And if you sort of had a friend who came to visit you in Missoula from some far-off place where they don't have wilderness areas and said, you know, I'm here because I really want to go to a wilderness area, and you took them to some restored area instead, even if they didn't recognize it, the intuition would be that they're being shortchanged. So therefore, he wants to conclude that like faked art is never as valuable as the original, restored nature can never have that same intrinsic value that these philosophers are identifying in original nature. And just to give you an example, here's an example. So Dane Scott, my good friend Dane Scott here, director of the Center for Ethics, promises me a Vermeer for my birthday, right? Because, you know, he's just become director of the Center for Ethics, and so, you know, he's getting paid a lot, right? So Dane promises me a Vermeer for my birthday, you know, and my birthday comes along, And he comes in, he sings happy birthday, he's got a great singing voice, and I say, oh, I'm so happy, yeah, the Vermeer, right? And he gives me this beautifully framed poster of a Vermeer that he bought from the Museum of Modern Art, right, in New York. And the language that Eliot puts on this is, I would have reason to feel disappointed, right? And I think that that's probably right. There's a good intuition behind that. And in the same way, your friend who wants to see the wilderness area and goes to the restored area has reason to be disappointed. Katz takes this kind of argument in his essays, which are all collected in this one book, Nature as Subject, in 1997. He pushes this even harder. And I won't go into all the reasons why. But Katz takes quite seriously that nature is not only this thing that has value, but it's a subject, like humans are a subject. And it has this sort of almost autonomy that when we do restorations, when we go in and we sort of take some area and we try to restore it, we're really doing violence to that subject of nature. And he presents a bunch of different arguments, and I'll just sort of give you a couple sort of choice quotes from some of these essays. He's worried that the duplicitous argument, very similar to Eliot's argument, I'm outraged by the idea that a technologically created nature will be passed off as reality. The hubris argument, the human presumption that we are capable of this technological fix, demonstrates once again the arrogance with which humanity surveys the natural world. Interesting argument, and I think deserves some response. If we think that we can fix anything, then what really is the motivation for preservation? If we can always go and sort of remake and terraform or whatever we're going to do to fix the natural world. And then the artifact argument, the recreated natural environment that is the end result of a restoration project is nothing more than an artifact created for human use. And so Katz is sort of one sort of way of looking at what Katz is doing is, he says, look, if you're going to have a truly ecological appreciation of nature, of the natural world, which includes a deep understanding of time, of the millennial processes that produce these landscapes, then for us in our sort of little short time frame to go in and try to fix the problem, given the limitations of our understanding, right, even, of how these processes might work, is foolhardy and also does violence to the thing itself. We should just leave it alone and let whatever is going to change, whatever is going to happen, change and happen over geological time. Now, the problem, there's lots of problems with these arguments, and in order to get tenure, I sort of went through and I went through very carefully the detailed philosophical arguments that all these guys are putting forward, and I answered them in the good way that philosophers are taught to do, but I'm not going to, fortunately for you, I'm not going to rehearse those arguments here. So what I want to point out to you is that one of the things I'm very much interested in, and I've always been interested in, and one of the things I like about being split between a philosophy department and a school of public policy right now, is the relationship between philosophy and policy, right? How is it that philosophy can best inform the policy process and in fact help to make it better, help us to make better decisions about what we're doing in environmental management? And we often think, well, philosophers write things and only philosophers are interested in them and that's it, and they're just, that's it. But it turns out to be the case that, whoops, sometimes people are actually listening, and in this case, the restoration community was listening to these particular debates, and my take on it is it kind of added fuel to the fire for a very bad trend in restoration ecology, and this is what has been called the authenticity debate. So the response by the restorationists when they heard the kinds of critiques that Eliot and Katz were making, restored nature is not real nature, is to think of this as a technical problem. And it makes sense because most of them are technically trained naturalists and scientists. So the claim was, okay, then we'll just make these things better, right? We'll just make them as close as possible to the original. And there was, for sure, a long simmering debate in the restoration community about what an authentic, what a good restoration would be. Did it have to go back to a particular period in history? Did it have to go back to a particular thing that we could identify was nature? And looking at the critique of the philosophers, the people most in favor of what they were calling the authentic restorations said, this is more proof that we should go and do this. Now, this does not provide an answer at all to the critiques that Eliot and Katz are giving, but the point was that you had this unfortunate fallout. It entrenches an orthodoxy that I trace back, and I'm sure a lot of you will know, the 1963 Starker-Leopold report, when Morris Udall got Starker-Leopold, one of Aldo Leopold's children, to lead this blue ribbon panel looking at a particular case of culling of elk in the Yosemite National Park. There are about 7,500 elk that had to be killed in Yosemite National Park because there were too many of them. They're munching up the landscape, causing horrendous ecological damage. The Park Service went and they started shooting the elk in order to solve an environmental problem. The public went berserk. Park Service is not supposed to shoot animals. This is wrong. You're supposed to take care of the animals. Yes, good elk, right? And so Udall gets Starker Leopold to sort of look at this case and then write an objective report. Did we do the right thing? And they go, yeah, you shot the elk. Good on you. Now, but there's more. Right? They wanted to provide a further justification, and the further justification was to say that shooting the elk was just the tip of the iceberg about the proper way to manage these areas like national parks and wilderness areas. That in fact, they should be managed as, and this is a quote from the report, as nearly as possible in the condition that prevailed when the area was first visited by the white man. Now this led to, depending on how you look at the history, and there is some controversy about it, perhaps instigating decades of fire suppression in the national parks, and you all know that that was a real bad idea, given the '88 Yellowstone fires. But also, in the restoration community, you see the same kind of claim. That the implication of this is that nature, right, the real nature, and by implication possibly that stuff that has intrinsic value, is that stuff that was here before Europeans got here and messed it all up, right? That should be the target. And just as that should be the target for the maintenance of the parks, that should be the target for restoration. So if you think that restorations are not real nature, then we'll just make restorations that are targeted towards that pre-Columbian or pre-settlement state. Then they'll be real nature. Now there's lots of problems with this, reasoning, as we all know. One is it assumes that indigenous changes to the land either didn't occur or were somehow more natural. We know there's ample archaeological and anthropological evidence now that Native Americans were burning prairies, they were pruning bushes for basket weaving, they were doing all kinds of stuff, completely making over the landscape. And so what are we supposed to sort of see these as sort of natural changes because they're natural and European Americans are not? That seems a bad way to go for many reasons and rather insulting. And also this sort of logic doesn't play well with other places, right? Namely places that don't have a pre-Columbian state because that's where Columbus came from. So if that's what authentic restoration is going to be, it's just not going to work. Okay. Now, the thing that I sort of noticed about all these debates, the sort of the critiques and the debates, is that they're really kind of endpoint focused. They're only focused on, they sort of think that the important philosophical issues are exhausted at the level of the end state, what we produce at the end of the day, what does it look like, how does it function, and then can we sort of attach these labels like intrinsic value and these sorts of things. But when I look at like the Chicago case, they're going back to, now they are going back to pre-Columbian there, the oak savanna, what they argue it is. But what seems to me much more interesting about a case like that is that public participation element, right? That it's not just the product of the restoration that produces certain kinds of choices, but the process of the restoration. The fact that the process of the restoration is not simply about producing a particular kind of landscape, but about but the potential of actually recreating the conditions whereby people had a closer connection to the land itself. And you read any environmental literature and you know that it's rife with this worry, that things went bad when, for various reasons, we humans became disconnected from the land around us. It could be, disconnected from where our food comes from or whatever. And it seems like in something like the Chicago case, you've really got this potential to use something like restoration and a lot of other environmental management practices as well to recreate this connection. So if the promise of restoration is not just found in the recreation of nature, however you want to define it, and I'd rather sort of stay out of that debate about what's the real nature and what's not, we can still see a value in restoration in the process because it presents this possibility of a restoration of the human cultural relationship with nature, no matter whether or not the thing you're producing is pre-Columbian or can be claimed to have intrinsic value, whatever. It produces a certain kind of value, and it's the value in creating a stronger attachment between people and the lands around them. And that creates a different set of questions for restoration ecology. One question is, how do you sort of shape a restoration to meet that potential? And I've sort of said, and I'll make the argument in the book, and we can talk about it later if you want, that one way of meeting that potential is, I think, by maximizing public participation. Dave, other city council members, they want to restore a wetland somewhere in Missoula, and they can, look in the back of a journal, the main journal for restorationists, or one of the main journals is called Ecological Restoration. Conveniently enough, it's here in the library. You go look it up. In the back third of it are a bunch of advertisements. Dave goes there, "Wetlands are us," right? Calls them up, landscape architecture firm, and they come out and they make you a wetland, right, with professional workers. Or you can do something kind of sloppier, costs less, that's a good thing, but takes a lot longer, using volunteers. And I want to sort of claim, given that these sort of values are inherent in restoration, it's better to do things in that way rather than just bringing in a professional firm and losing that potential, right, for creating that connection between people and the land around them. But I think there are going to be other ways to meet this potential too, and that's one of the things I'm going to talk about next. And the particular question I want to ask is, does meeting that kind of potential of the restoration of the human cultural relationship with the environment, with nature, whatever you want to call that thing out there, does it mean necessarily eliminating all trace of human habitation? And that certainly seems to be implied by the kinds of restorations that follow what we interpret as the mandate of the Starker-Leopold report. Go back to the thing before the white man showed up with his tools and other kinds of things that are very bad. So here is a very quick sketch of an alternative way of thinking about the environment, environmental values, which I think doesn't lead to the necessity of those conclusions that we saw with the L8s and CATs, the intrinsic instrumental value sorts of things, then I think will lead us towards a kind of an intuition. At least I think I should be able to justify the intuition for why we might want to be able to keep traces of human habitation in the land. In fact, we ought to, when we can, in cases of restoration, and then we'll get to the example. So here's the book, Environment and Values, soon to be on the bookshelves, hopefully in the fall. And we have sort of three parts to this book. And the first part of the book is claiming that the primary form of establishing environmental values is utilitarian and consequentialist, dominated by environmental economics. And this is sort of our what's wrong with cost-benefit analysis once more with feeling, kind of part of the book. Yeah, I got to do that, right? Keep on. You beat on The Economist because they run the world. They can take it. It does not matter. Secondly, we go through those intrinsic value, non-anthropocentric arguments that environmental ethicists have been developing since the 70s, and we give lots of sort of reasons why we think that those aren't the right way to go, both philosophical and sort of at the intersection between philosophy and public policy. And then thirdly, we give what John O'Neill and Alan Holland call the old world alternative, right? Remember, if you're going to think about environmental management in Britain, you can't sort of separate the natural stuff and the cultural stuff and just push them apart and say that we're going to prioritize one or the other, because they're also intertwined and intermingled. So the claim here is that all environmental values, no matter where they are historically situated. Even in places where we might arguably have wilderness areas, we only have them because we set them aside, right? We humans decided to set something aside and give it a specific level of protection. It might even be the case that it's sort of projecting some kind of myth, some romantic myth about wilderness. But without having to answer those questions, we know that they're historically situated in some kind of dialogue between humans and the natural world. And that understanding the historically situated and contextual nature of those values is the big challenge for thinking about how we value nature. Now, does this solve the problems of valuing nature? No, it makes them much, much more complicated. But we sort of say that, look, the easy ascription of cost-benefit reasoning or intrinsic value reasoning is just sort of making an end run around the really hard problems, right? That we all value nature for very, very many different reasons. Many of these reasons are very good, and that only getting in there and biting the bullet and thinking about the long historical story about the relationship between humans and the land around them is the way to solve these problems. So the operative questions that we look at are, the idea is to preserve, this is from an earlier article that Alan Holland wrote with Kate Rawls, to preserve the future as a realization of the potential of the past. It's about negotiating the transition from past to future in such a way as to secure the transfer of maximum significance, which is a sort of a very vague phrase, but essentially the operative questions are these. If we're thinking about managing a particular area, what makes the most appropriate trajectory from what had gone before, right? It can't just simply be a question of what my friend Brian Norton says, chunking and counting, which is the cost-benefit analysis. Just take the chunks of the things out there and you count them, you give them value, or the chunk and sort. You take the things out there and you go intrinsically valuable, instrumentally valuable, and we separate them, and then it gives us a neat and tidy answer. Let's talk about the trajectory of the relationship that we had with this place, and then what place goes there before. What's the best way to continue the narrative of places that are being described? Of course, we know that the narratives are always going to be multiple, that many people occupy the land, many peoples have occupied the land around Montana, and that there would be something wrong with making a land management decision which completely ignored those different narratives that exist in this place, but negotiating them is the hard democratic problem for environmental management that I think we can't avoid. Now, when it comes to restoration, I want to say that historically speaking, this kind of reasoning, and there's leaving out a lot of the detail here, but just so we can get to the examples and some questions, I'll go straight to the punchline here, is that when we're thinking about restorations, maximally, what we'd want to do, I think, when possible, and this is sort of the same way I think about the public participation issue, when it's possible to include the public participating in restoration, we have moral reasons that we should. Not always going to be possible given the scale and complexity of these problems. When possible, I think that we should actively preserve what I want to call the disturbance memory of a site. The reason for why it is the case that we have to do a restoration in the first place. Every time we do a restoration, there's a reason that we have to do it. An industrial process, an agricultural process, something. At least when we're talking about anthropogenically caused restorations. And I think that we should actively try to preserve some vestige of that on the site rather than simply wipe the slate clean and pretend that we're recreating the pristine environments, of the pre-Columbian period. And I'll give two reasons. One is that I think it seems to be the case we live in a culture where we appear to believe that we have communal obligations to the past, right? We memorialize things. We tend to have ritualize our connection with people in the past, regardless of our views about, whether or not they're, paying attention anymore or can. We have these communal obligations to the past, and we tend to use this in such a way of memorialize these things in such a way that we respect the efforts of the people that came before us. And I think when we're doing restorations, for example, on a site where there has been some kind of disturbance, say an industrial process, we ought to respect the memory of those people who were there before that were participating in the industrial process. And you'll see the reason why I got involved in one of the reasons I got involved in the project I'm going to talk about before is because I'm the grandson of two West Virginia immigrant coal miners. My grandfather spent their entire lives underground mining coal, and they weren't the sort of the guys with the top hats. I'm going to destroy nature. No, I mean that wasn't the thing, right? It wasn't it. They were guys who needed a job to bring their families over from Europe, and they were unskilled labor, and that's what they wound up doing. And they spent their lives doing that. And if to restore an area that they were involved in, some of these mines that they worked in, so that it completely ignored, wiped over the trace of that, I think my intuitions are there would be something that's wrong. And the reason is that even if an end was knowingly destructive, it wasn't intended as such by all people. One of the problems that I see with a lot of environmentalism today is that it tends to sort of like push the sides. They're the bad guys and the good guys, right? They're sort of the tree lovers, and the evil, greedy bastards out there who are doing bad things. And that just doesn't seem to be the case. There are lots of cases of environmental damage or just unintended consequences. People didn't know what they were doing. No one set off in the 19th century, I will now create global warming and screw up people in the future, but make a great film for Al Gore that he can, It wasn't like that. So given that we don't want to demonize people in the future, in the past, given their unintended consequences, I think that this is a rationale for preserving some vestige of this industrial memory, which is going to go against those intuitions of the authenticity debate we talked about before. The second would be, if I had more time to sort of spell it out for you, that we have communal obligations to people in the future, I think we should, leave them a little message not to act unsustainably again. I mean, one of the worries, right, that Katz and Elliott have is this sort of human hubris worry. If we get so good at restoration that we could recreate exactly the pristine environments that were there before, then it creates hubris. Then we'll just go on and do it again and again. We'll keep making the same kinds of mistakes. But I think that respecting that kind of intuition, we shouldn't pretend that these things didn't happen. In fact, should preserve some of this industrial memory as a message into the future. Okay, so here's a project that I think that by sort of using this reasoning participated in to sort of help make an argument for what we should do with a particular place facing this particular question. I'm going to talk about Vintondale, Pennsylvania, which is right here, just a little bit east of Pittsburgh, right smack in the middle of coal country. And it's a small village. It still has a population, not a very sizable population because the colliery and the mines there are shut down, but nonetheless there. And it's a site of acid mine drainage, which I'm sure many people are familiar with in this room. It's also a ubiquitous problem in the West. You cap mines, and you get water coming down, hitting the hillsides, going into the mines, washing metals off of the that are exposed in the sides, the open sides of the mines. Eventually the caps break, the polluted water comes out, it goes into the nearest riparian area and messes up the pH and starts destroying everything in its path. There's basically destroys stuff. You have to mitigate this problem. I mean, state regulations, federal regulations require mitigation of acid mine drainage, so it's already mandated. We have to do some kind of project involving mitigation and restoration, which involves cleaning up the water and then sending it into usually a constructed wetland where it will be re-oxygenated, and then the water is then let go into an active stream or river or whatever it is, and not causing the same kind of problem. And in 1994, there's a historian named T. Allen Comp who started something called acid mine drainage and art, and the idea was to try to do these projects with a little bit more creativity than they were being done up until that point. And they picked Vintondale as the model project, the first of several projects, a 35-acre site on an old site of a colliery, a coal washing facility, to clean up the acid mine drainage. And they planted a 31 species, 7 acres, native species, 7-acre wetland as a part of this. Here's the old site of Vintondale. This is the historical picture. So you've got, and I want to sort of point to a couple things to keep in mind. There's an opening of the mine up here. This kind of ridge line here, this is all artificial. This is a bony pile, so you've got the slag, the sort of refuse from the mining process that's all piled up there. Here's the creek sort of running along here. And in what used to be the wetland, what used to be the lowest patch here, so that would be adjacent to this railroad track, you've got the colliery, the coal washing facility right smack in the middle of a drained wetland, and then the town of Vintondale around it. Here's what it looked like before any work started. So there's that bony pile again, and there's the water coming out of the open mine, and the picture doesn't do it justice. I mean, it's sort of a brighter, more nauseating orange than that, and you've only got a couple sort of hardy, woody species that are surviving at all, and you can sort of imagine what's going on to the fish in Blacklick Creek and the crawdads and all the other kinds of things that are there, not doing pretty well. So we've got sort of to mitigate this. Here's the sort of the site of the colliery itself. Before any work was started, a lot of industrial refuse lying around there, foundations of the old colliery. And here is the rather brilliant, I want to say, site plan that was proposed by Julie Bargman, who is a landscape architect at the University of Virginia. And after meeting extensively with members of the community, and I mean this idea of I think I'm sort of beginning to see my career as coming up with sort of sort of justifications, elaborate philosophical justifications for things that just make intuitive common sense to most people. So but I think that's partly why maybe they might be right. But this really was, I mean, the people meeting in Vintondale, and I don't know if you remember the very first slide I showed of sort of people sitting around the table, it was from Vintondale as well. They were very receptive to this idea. When Alan Comp and the crew came in and sort of said, what about we don't destroy the whole industrial site? when we do this restoration, they immediately said, fantastic, finally someone's making sense to them, because their families had all spent their lives in this area. So the way that Julie sort of designed this particular site is, first you've got these settling ponds, and this is kind of the mitigation part of the, this is how we clean up the water coming out of the mine number 3 up here, and the discharge pipeline. And you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 settling ponds, and this slows down that orange water coming out of the mine and lets the heavier metals drop to the bottom of these ponds, and then the ponds fill up, and it sort of runs over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at the bottom of this particular pond. You've got a passive treatment system and a pump that takes the water from this pond and pumps it up into the top of this pond, where it goes through a layer of compost and it's cleaned up even more. The pH sort of starts to balance in the water, and then it's let go into this wetland where it's going to slowly make its way until it's discharged into the creek. Now here is the sort of the disturbance memory part of the project, is that the foundations of the mine, of the colliery, are left completely intact. So rather than getting rid of all that industrial debris, all of this stuff, we're actually leaving part of it. And in fact, putting the wetland inside of it, so that you've got this restoration of the wetland that was there before, but also this preservation of the thing that was there. Completely anathema to any kind of intuitions that would be that we sort of restore things to the point at which they were, before anyone got there, in fact, preserving that. So here's the process. There's a lot of buy-in from the community on this process. They're the ones who are going to monitor these settling ponds and the wetland over time. And they're the ones who are going to sort of alert the Department of Natural Resources when that compost layer needs to be changed out, when the pump breaks down, this kind of thing. So here we are, involving them in the project from the get-go, sampling the water, figuring out how many ponds you have to clean up the water. Beginning, these are AmeriCorps volunteers planting these trees, and then cleaning out the industrial debris, but then leaving the sort of the foundations there, like the coke ovens, the machine shop. And this is a litmus garden. Let me just sort of back up just a second here, because once you sort of you stop thinking about restoration as going back to nature, however you want to define that, then you can get kind of creative, because sort of you can get a little bit more lenient. So one artist wrote an independent grant piggybacked on this project, and what she wanted to do, and this came from the Heinz Foundation, was, remember Teresa Heinz? Yeah. Remember the Heinz Foundation? They do good work. They still do. And what she wanted to do was sort of like, so this is sort of the interesting part of the project. This seems less interesting, right? This is just the cleaning up the water, and the water looks bad at the beginning. Like, how do you get people sort of interested in going up there and looking at the project? And she says, okay, well, I'm going to plant some native species of trees, deciduous trees, along this, because as the water goes down down from one pond to the other, it changes color, right? It goes from sort of orange to yellow, right, to sort of clear, something looking like water. So she plants trees that at peak foliage mirror the color of the water. So you get the red trees up here and the yellow trees down here and stuff like this. And this creates this garden for people who like gardens to go up and look at it. Where did it go? Oh, there it is. Okay. And then lots of signage. I mean, not worried about faking nature here at all, not worried about fooling people, making them think that they're involved in an experience that is a pristine wetland, putting signage up there explaining how the wetland works, putting the pictures of the old coal mine sites of the miners, and explaining the history of the town. And what you get as a result, I think, is this, from a project like this. I would want to argue a more historically appropriate project for this particular site, because it's integrated with the surrounding ecological and historical landscapes in a much more responsible way than just simply getting rid of all of this stuff and putting in a wetland. It restores the ecosystem function. Again, the original justification for why we do these restoration projects, there's got to be some ecological need. It does restore the ecosystem function in the area, and it preserves that industrial memory, which I think is just that added sort of making this project a bit better. So that's it. I'll stop there. Some questions. Thank you. Yes.
Professor, this might be kind of getting to the issue you wanted to dodge, but considering global climate change and fire suppression, what degree of loyalty do we owe historical conditions when establishing reference conditions for forest restoration projects on public lands?
What?
What degree of loyalty do we owe historical conditions
Mm-hmm.
when we restore national forests?
When we restore national forests?
National public land projects that, for instance, we have roadless areas that groups propose that need restoration because of past fire suppression.
Right.
So they propose to go in and thin because they don't match historical conditions.
Right, right.
For disturbance patterns.
Yeah.
Now, in the face of global climate change, what degree of loyalty do we owe those historic conditions?
Well, I'm not sure what role the climate change issue, I mean, I think that I'd want to separate those two
Yeah.
questions. I think the first part of the question is a good question in and of itself. And then what does climate change do to this? There was, and this is not exactly what you're asking, but let me just sort of, before getting to the first question, talk about this for a second. There are people out there sort of say, given climate change, given what we can think about as far as the changes in the landscape that will be happening because of climate change, there's no point in thinking about restoration anymore. The best we can do is sort of manage for future changes in the land, and that's that, right? And I was at a conference at the School of Architecture at Harvard a number of years ago where I was first starting to think about this particular argument. And there was a very famous environmental writer there, someone who I've long admired, who had just moved from the West Coast up to I think the Upper Peninsula in Michigan, and had bought a tree stand, sort of an acreage with a bunch of trees on it, and was bemoaning, it wasn't climate change, but acid rain. She was sort of like, this is a severely degraded area, so restoration needs to happen, but given, how bad acid rain is in the area, what's the point in doing it? Because it's just going to be destroyed later, and there will be no connection between the thing that was there in the past and the thing that was there in the future. And this made me very depressed, because I thought, what a short-sighted kind of only the end point of the restoration matters kind of view. If this became a project that the local community could participate in, it's this opportunity for sharing local ecological knowledge, for getting people interested in the welfare of this forest as it's connected to these other global issues. And to just think about it's only the end product that matters in some restoration cases is, I think, a bit short-sighted. Now, with respect to that question, though, the thinning of the wilderness areas because of fire suppression, I'm not in a good position to answer that question. I know it's a very controversial proposal, and there seems to me to be ample reasons to believe that not everyone who is making these proposals for thinning of the trees is doing it for exactly the most environmentally virtuous reasons. So I'm going to remain silent on that one. Yeah.
I find your idea about disturbance memories intriguing, and I like the example that you gave, but I wonder with something like fire that burns, how you can sustain that disturbance memory. So if the goal is to restore the natural fire in our forests, the disturbance memory of our century of fire suppression would probably be our dense, thick, overgrown forests. But if we put fire back into them, we're getting very extreme fires that are, burning everything out. So
Right.
what would be the case in that situation?
Well, that doesn't seem to me so much a question of restoration, but a question of, reintroducing fire as an element in an ecosystem. And I think that, that's one of the big, questions of the Parks Department and the Forest Service, and sort of figuring out how it is that they're going to reintroduce fire in areas that where you had active fire suppression. And there's been some successes and some failures so far in doing that. But it's certainly the case that with a lot of these, just think about an area that's not already a densely packed woodlot or something like that. Restoring an ecosystem where fire was an active part of it is an interesting challenge for at least the authenticity side of the restoration argument. And you hear this a lot when you're looking at things like prairie restoration. So prairie is a prime example of an ecosystem that evolved with an active fire regime caused by lightning strikes. Whatever is going to sort of exist out there in these giant swaths in the Midwest has got to be able to sort of flourish under conditions of fire. And that's the kind of ecosystem that you have, and that's why the prairies didn't all sort of revert to woodlots or to woodlands. And a lot of critics of restoration inside and outside the restoration community will say prairie restorations are a waste of time because you can never build a prairie big enough that's actually going to have an active evolutionary future connected to this fire regime, right? Because you can't build something that's so big that it's going to get struck by lightning and burn the appropriate times of year and also not cause a huge threat to people's private homes. And so as a result, whenever you burn a prairie, or whenever you sort of reconstruct a prairie, you've got to burn it on a regular basis. You've got to actively go in there and burn it. And from the sort of the view of sort of saying that restorations are bad because this is artifacts, because they're a kind of human constructed artifact, this is a prime example of what's wrong, right, with restorations. You're not creating an ecosystem that can survive on its own. You're creating an ecosystem that's dependent on human intervention in order for it to survive into the future, because you're going to go in there and burn. But from the process-oriented look at restoration, rather than just looking at the product, I see this as an opportunity, right, not a limitation. Because what it means is that when you get a bunch of people together to restore a prairie and they get that sense of commitment and connection to the land from having done a prairie restoration, you've got this opportunity every year to get more people involved and interested in the health of that prairie by creating, prairie festivals, organized around burning, and people like to burn things. It's fun. So it creates this opportunity to bring more people into that community, I think, that's connected to the land because of that. Now, in the case of, the increased litter in wilderness areas because of fire suppression, not a good idea for the scouting troop to get involved in that one, right? But so leave that up to the professionals. Yeah, Christopher.
Would it be possible, do you think, to max out the value of disturbance memory? Because this is it's a wonderful example, but in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, there might be 150 such places. If you were doing the same thing in every place or something similar, might you reach a threshold where you might get to one site and you want to say no?
Sure. Well, you can imagine limitations based on resources. I mean, if there's not a community there that's interested in the project, that could be some reason to set it aside. But it could be a little thing. It could be a very little thing. I'm blanking on the name. Steve Windhager, right? There's a guy named Steve Windhager who used to be a philosopher who now is a fire ecologist, right? So he sort of made the transition, where all philosophers are headed, I think. And Steve Windhager is the head of the restoration programs at the Lady Bird Johnson National Wildflower Center in Austin, Texas, which is a wonderful, wonderful place, which has just been folded into the University of Texas in Austin, and it's great. You should go see it. It's incredible. Great wildflowers, but also great restoration projects. And what he's looking at there is the question of, you think of thousands of mine sites. He's looking at the problem of reverting Texas rangeland, right, which is no longer being actively grazed, to something like, prairie again. And what's the most effective way of doing that? And they have, it's good scientific project. They've got all these experimental plots that they experiment with, mowing or burning, or a combination of mowing or burning at different times of the year to see what regime produces the most biomass and the most biodiversity. And there, I sort of said, well, and Steve and I were talking about this, and he goes, right, so leaving old farm equipment out there, right, on these ranches, maybe might be a good thing. I'm like, yeah, that might be a very good thing. Rusty old tractors out there in the world. I think that would be great, and be a kind of a nice example of just sort of getting a little pinch of this. So there's nothing, I think, that this is not a kind of an argument that, a restoration couldn't possibly be good if it didn't include this element even to a minor extent. But there are really ambitious projects like this. The biggest, there's an amazing project in the old steelmaking part of Germany, in the Ruhr Valley, around Dusseldorf. There, the entire steel, it's like the Pittsburgh of Germany. Everything's shut down. The gasification plants, the coal mines, the blast furnaces, all when steelmaking in Europe was rationalized. And they're trying to figure out what to do with this. And instead of tearing down all the stuff, and we're talking about 300 square kilometers, right, of industrial memory, and it was all preserved. It was all preserved and allowed to rust with dignity and have volunteer plants grow on it. And it's one of the most absolutely brilliant nature parks I've ever seen in my entire life. And they sort of put all these parks in between it, and you can ride on, 1,000 kilometers of trails in order to sort of see all of this stuff. So you can sort of even imagine this on a much larger scale, which
Where
would
was
get
that
this.
again?
In Germany, in Düsseldorf. Oh, actually, in fact, I have a picture. Here it is. Yeah. Get your hand up in the back.
Interested in your notion of relationship with nature. And I'm wondering if you see value in relationships with nature that include discovery and mystery and the less known.
Yes. Sure. Absolutely. I think there is. I mean, I don't have this view that, and I think that most environmental ethicists of my generation have abandoned, are not really sort of saying, look, there's got to be one reason why nature is valuable, and if we just got to sort of find that thing, then we've discovered the holy grail of environmental ethics, and then we'll be, real famous. But it's more like looking at the many multiple plural ways in which people value nature. And that's certainly, I mean, this view that I've been working on with my colleagues in Britain really respects that, that you can't sort of all boil it down to one particular reason why people do or even should value nature, because like the reasons that we value other people, they're going to be multiple and plural, and they'll exist in a sort of a very complicated, interesting way. Now, that's not a reason to sort of get around the hard choices. It just means that the hard choices are going to be much harder than we might have even thought before, right? Now, certainly there can be bad reasons to value nature, right? Or bad ways in which we do value nature. We can sort of imagine that. I think the strictly speaking, chunk and count, it all comes down to the price we can attribute to it through some fancy contingent valuation exercise is severely limited and just doesn't do the job, And we need to be able to make arguments about why that's short-sighted, why that's limited. But sure.
You do think there are criteria out there that might be used to distinguish between good and less good relationships with nature?
Yes.
What might some of those criteria be?
I'm not really sure. But I think that I do take quite seriously. I mean, the way that I look at this is, I think we have lots of very serious environmental problems, and at this point, I'm interested in two kinds of questions. And one is, what are the kinds of practices that you can allow people, make available to people, which will get them to take those problems more seriously, that will in fact see them as moral problems, as problems that are just as dire and as important as any other problem that they think that they confront in their everyday lives, right? And the second question that I'm interested in is, what is the way that you can build human communities and habitats in such a way that people are forced to live in a more respectful and responsible way with respect to the natural environment, right? How can you sort of make places so that the smartest way to live is one where you just are acting sustainably, right? Where it no longer makes sense to own an SUV, right? It no longer makes sense to drive every day to work, right? Because of the way that the infrastructure is set up. It just seems easier to do these kinds of things. I'm not of the view that everyone in the world needs to have this harmonious connection with nature in order to get, I mean, I hope it's not the case that everyone in the world needs to have some heightened level of environmental consciousness in order to solve the dire problems we have like global warming. Because if that's the case, then boy, we're out of luck, right? Because that's a millennial project. That's not something that happens in the short run. So we got to kind of work on both of these things. And the better and worse ways, I sort of take, I mean, at this moment, I think we're going to have to take a sort of a fairly crude yardstick on the better and worse ways in which people can live with respect to the world around them, and namely the one that gets the results that I think we got to sort of get to right now.
Two more questions.
I just wanted to briefly say that you're looking at this kind of, in a historical sense, projecting into the future in much the way that we look at archaeological sites. You would think people hundreds of years from now might want to look back and see historically what was, is that a component of this, like a little component of it?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. In the same way, and also it sort of mirrors a lot of the active debates in archaeology right now, and I only know this because I've got a colleague at the University of Washington who does philosophy of archaeology. She's the only person in the world who does. She invented the field, and she's the best person in it. And, pretty good trick there, you know. And she has we've had a lot of very interesting conversations about. We were both living in New York at the same time. We both moved to Washington at the same time. So we've been having these conversations for a long time about ethical responsibilities in archaeology. And I think that sort of some of the considerations I've been talking about here mirror quite closely those. So, and I want to take Albert and Bill because
I would like to invite you to speculate a little about the normative question that Bill raised a moment ago. The pre-Columbian standard, has lots of problems and makes a promise that cannot be kept.
Mm-hmm.
But it's attractive because it gives you a definite standard
Yes.
to work towards. And I agree with, the sort of historical, pragmatic, pluralist approach that you take. But perhaps one way of at least speculating about how this may work is to think of cultural or artistic movements. They start creatively, but then they do evolve paradigms, norms over time. And it's also important, if there's a process of learning and not just starting all over every time, there have to be these sort of norms and paradigms. Look at these people, look at those people, what they did. Do you think something like that is possible? That these things like Chartres, Saint-Denis will evolve in standards, of aesthetics perhaps, or balance, or whatever.
I think so. I think so, and I think that's it's a really insightful way of thinking about this. Is that at the end of the day, I mean, the sort of the challenge up until this point in the restoration community has been to, and our mutual friend Eric Higgs, who's written a wonderful book on this topic, Nature by Design, I think would agree with this assessment. Is that the challenge has been to sort of get us in the humanities, right, to get our foot in the door of the conversation about restoration. The scientists are there, the resource managers are there, the social scientists are largely there, right? But the voices in the humanities, I think we sort of had to suffer from a kind of a legacy of, if that's your view, right, which seems so overly simplifying the question of what the value of these things are, then I don't want to hear what you have to say if you're a philosopher. So, and Eric Higgs, who is the director of the School of Environmental Studies at University of Victoria, is trained as a philosopher and a planner, and eventually became the president of the Society for Ecological Restoration, and I think that was sort of a testament to his good work to sort of open that door. So that's been the project up until now, and so now sort of everyone is sort of willing to say, whatever this practice is of ecological restoration, it's not just technical. It's not just a technical artifice, right? It's like the way that I think about architecture is an art for me, and I think the indications that you gave are right. And I work a lot now with the Center for Sustainable Development in the School of Architecture at University of Texas at Austin, which is one of the centers for architects working on sustainable development questions. And in hanging out with these guys, I took a sabbatical there, and I go back every year. And hanging out with these guys who are not only doing architectural theory, but actually building, things, they feel this enormous pressure, right? But it's an appropriate form of pressure because they are sort of making the world around us. They're literally making the world around us. And they get pressure on the aesthetic front, they get pressure on the social concerns front, whether it involves social justice or gender equity or whatever else. And now it's the environmental front. Now, the things you build not only have to be beautiful and responsible, but also environmentally responsible. And it's a very difficult thing, and it causes them to tear their hair out and stuff. But they take the conversation seriously. And they're learning from mistakes in a good sort of pragmatic fashion. They sort of see the past examples of the schools of thought that came before them as a series of experiments that are to be learned from. And I think that this is sort of where restoration ecology is going to go. We've seen the same thing happen in landscape architecture, and I think that restoration is going to sort of ought to be in the future thought of as more of an art form in that sense, which is this delicate balancing of these particular things. And to go back to, I mean, I do take this question very seriously. Are there more responsible ways in which we can imagine living with the environment? And I'm not a crude pragmatist or crude consequentialist, which I can sound like at times. Just get people to take the Kyoto Protocol seriously. That's all we want. And, and I don't think anything that we do would be responsible to do that. But really, under the influence of my colleagues in Britain, I think that the soundest way to think of this is in the old language of virtues, And the more time I spend in this profession, the more I think, and we had this conversation 8 years ago, Aristotle just did get it all right. We're just rediscovering this, That's about character. There's something about character that we don't need to worry about whether or not nature is this subject that we have responsibilities towards, but who we are. Who are we individually as people? Who are we as a community? And how? Well, how is it that our relationship with the natural world around us says something about who we are as individuals and as a community? And I think once you look at it that way, you also sort of think of that community as not just this snapshot in time, but it's transgenerational, right? And the way that Gore ends his film. And I really do like that film, by the way. I didn't mean to sound like I didn't. Yeah, I think he ends it completely appropriately, right? He takes it back to his local environment, which is how I think that the best shot that we have of getting people to take environmental issues seriously is first getting them interested in their local environment. So it goes back to that farm where he learned to love nature, and he asks the question, what will the future generations think of us, right? And the choices that we made and how those say who we are. And I think that that is the question for this practice.
Just a quick, this was terrific, Andrew. Just a quick observation and then a question. The observation is I'm the disturbance memory element, and I'm intrigued that you got to talking about the arts just now also. So frequently that it is the artist's work. This evening walked by the teepee burner sculpture on campus, which is one of my very favorite things on campus, which of course is the disturbance memory of the fight to fix the air pollution in Missoula South. And now just to add another little irony on top, the sculpture itself has been restored. So there's an arts element that your comments got me thinking about. But my question is, it seems to me, and of course, as a political theorist, there's a political piece sitting just next door to the argument that you're doing tonight. And I know that you're familiar with it. If people have been trying to accumulate political authority in the name of nature, defending nature, correcting nature, whatever. It's a very long tradition in Western societies to base authority claims on in terms of speaking for nature. Right. Then that makes this restoration argument. It's always seemed to me that that's what gives the restoration argument the sort of vehemence that it has. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Absent that political question, I'm not sure it would be. Your depiction of it, I think, is excellent. It's been a very vigorous and sort of exercised debate. Does that suggest that the real problem is what's an environmental politics look like that's not speaking for nature's intrinsic value, that's not grabbing that as its source of authority? And I knew Brent about this, but I just thought I'd mention it because I think there's that political piece that, in a sense, is just next to the argument
sure.
we're elaborating.
I mean, I think we both share the view that environmental politics can't. I mean, the ways in which we understand environmental politics can't only be defined in terms of, speaking for this intrinsic value in nature. And I think that the problem, right, one of the problems with that is that, I mean, this is a question of human projection, usually anthropomorphic projection on the world, And this is sort of the problem that I have, and I think maybe what you're thinking of with the identity model, right, of environmental politics. I've got a very close friend in the kind of environmental philosophy world who, in all sincerity, once turned to me and he sort of said, my problem, Andrew, is I'm just too close to the earth. I was like, said, yeah, that is a problem, right? And it's a problem not just because I'm sure it provides like lots of psychological distress, for the individual who said this, but also because it sort of gives this view that by disposition almost, or by the very sort of ontology, personal ontology of one's identity, that there are just some of us who are the Julia Butterfly Hills of the world and have this intimate connection, and there are others who are just the selfish, greedy bastards out there. And the thing that the problem with that is it just does it does divide the world. I mean, it makes environmentalism this completely partisan issue of a really weird sort, because it's kind of the left, but a weird version of the left, a weird misanthropic version of the left, the sort of the strange dark side of Ed Abbey part of the left kind of thing, which I've never really understood. And that identity model, I think, needs to be replaced with, and you can find that in restoration. I must say, I've got a whole chapter, right, where I talk about ritual in restoration. And there's a lot of people who want to ritualize restoration. So, we go to restorations and we sort of create almost a liturgy around them. And one of the reasons that I'm really worried about that, and a liturgy about, our connection with the earth. And one of the reasons that I worry about that is that, well, the thing I like about restoration is like anybody can get involved with it, but as soon as you sort of like creating this identity liturgy around restoration, then it becomes a kind of a source of alienation. I mean, this thing should not, doing something good like restoration should not mean you have to give up your beliefs about, God or, whatever your sort of religious beliefs or commitments or lack thereof, whatever, right? And the alternative I see is a citizenship model, right? Basically where our obligations to the environment are not obligations to nature, but they're obligations to our fellow citizens. And again, this is Aristotelian, right? That our civic obligations are not just merely exhausted at the level of voting, or something like this, but it is a responsibility to actively take part in your community. Not because you're protecting that subject of nature out there, because it is like participating in the PTA, right? There's an element of self-interest, but there's also the element of doing something good for the people around you. And that kind of classic Republican model of citizenship, if that could be the model for environmentalism, then it is necessarily democratic, right? It can't be corrupted in the same kind of way, I think, as the identity kind of worrisome model, right, that we've seen before. It has to be democratic, because if it's not, it can't have that civic obligation component to it. And I, for one, I'm still hopeful. If I wasn't hopeful that we can't come up with sort of democratic solutions to environmental problems that also maintain our democratic institutions, then I would just, give up and become an economist, right? So, thank you very much.
Well, that exchange.